Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Hello everybody, welcome to this Talking Tendons podcast. Before I start today, I just want to mention I do have a Mastering Lower Limb Tendinopathy course series coming up. It's going to be in Glasgow, it's going to also be in Manchester, and it is lastly going to be in London on September I think it's 4th, 5th and 6th, so have a look out for that on the Tendinopathy rehab website. So, today's podcast is going to be about a paper that just came out, and the title it was in JAMA, and the title is The Effect of Ultrasonography-Guided Corticosteroid Injection versus Placebo, added to exercise therapy for Achilles tendinopathy. There's lots of great authors on there, including Michael Kjær, Peter Magnusson and Michael Rathleff. So, this is really an interesting study, and there has been a bit of interest already on social media. It's only been out for a couple of days, and I'm also leading a trial looking at the high volume injection, which with or without steroid in Achilles. So this was of particular interest to me. It's also interesting because we know that Achilles tendinopathy is very hard to manage, and something that might help is always well received. So it's such a simple design, which I really think is fantastic. There's two arms. I really applaud the research group who sort of thought, you know what, let's just look at steroid, even though there's a lot of controversy about rupture and about the safety of steroid, and also the longer term harms, so whether people have recurrences when they have steroid. We're just going to look at it, and because we just don't know. In Achilles tendinopathy, the reality is it hasn't been looked at long term, and that's what these guys did. They just looked at steroid versus sham or placebo added to exercise over 24 months. Okay, so very simple design, but very necessary question to be answered. So I think they need to be congratulated for actually tackling this question first of all. And the Achilles is probably the one where there's most sort of feelings of it's going to rupture, or we shouldn't be injecting steroid. And that might be true, but the only way to really know is to look at the long-term data, which is what this group has contributed. So that's a really positive part of this paper, I think. So basically, they then went on and they randomized their mid-portion Achilles tendinopathy group. They randomized them to the sham or to the steroid, corticosteroid injection. Importantly, they injected it in the interface between the Kjær's fat pad and the Achilles tendon. That's exactly what we're doing in our trial, and what the high volume injection does, injects right into that interface, not into the tendon. So that's an important point. They offered them 3 injections, so up to 3 injections, and that was depending on their response. I think there was 12 people that had 3 in the steroid group and 35 people that had 3 in the non-steroid group, which indicates that clearly the steroid group was having greater effect. So that was in the first 3 months. I believe every 4 weeks they offered another steroid if required. They utilized the heavy slow resistance program, which this group pioneered. So that was their rehab program for this intervention, for both intervention groups. So the other thing they did that was quite interesting is that they stopped them from exercising for the first 3 months. So that was interesting, I thought. And we'll talk about how that might interact with the outcome of this trial. 3 months, I guess, from a point of view of practicality for some patients, I am thinking of elite sport, is not going to work, obviously. But for other patients, it might. If you say to them, look, you're going to stop running for 3 months, but you'll probably have a better outcome, they might. I wonder whether they did that because they were worried about the recurrence of steroid and feeling really good and people going out and doing too much when potentially the tissue is not ready for it. So from a safety point of view, it sort of makes sense. But it's a key part of this intervention, because no other study that I've seen has done that. And, possibly it was a good move, because what I'm going to go on to say here is that actually they did get some good benefits from the steroid. So we'll talk about that in a second. So let's talk about that now. We're pretty much up to the results. So basically the main outcome was the visa outcome. And if you look at the graph, it's one of the graphs, I think it's figure 2, they show that the visa outcome at 1, 2, 3, 6 and 24 months was superior to the other group, the placebo group or sham group, but not at 12 months. So that was the only time it wasn't superior. So it was superior for all the other outcomes. So there was a beneficial effect of steroid. And the other key finding from this study is that there were no ruptures. Okay, and that's really important. They randomized about 50 people per group. In the end, they had a fair bit of attrition, but I think it was 20% or even more by 12 months. So a fair bit of attrition, which was even between the groups, but still a consideration, that level of attrition. But the key finding here is that they didn't get any steroid related ruptures or adverse events that was severe, and they also found benefit from the steroid. So obviously there's a lot of things said about steroid, but the way that these guys did it with the 3 months rest initially seems to have led to benefit. Now, it's possible that there was some interaction between the 3 months rest that was important to allow safety, as I mentioned earlier, from the steroid, or to allow the effect of the steroid or the exercise to work. But it's important to take all the intervention as a whole, and that is they did the steroid, they also did the 3 months rest. You can't do one without the other, or you may not be guaranteed the same outcome if you do. So that's really interesting part of this trial. There was a reduction in thickness of the tendon, which mirrored the improvements in visa, which suggests that the steroid is probably having, and that was only in the steroid group, suggesting the steroid is having some sort of tissue-based effect as well. You'd imagine it is. It's a strong anti-inflammatory, reduces cell proliferation. It's having some effect there. Interestingly, those effects of the tissue thickness, but also the visa, seem to have some sort of recurrence. So one of the issues with steroid is we talk about recurrence with steroid. And I think the biggest limitation of this study, in my opinion, is that there is a substantial recurrence that occurs from from month 6 to month 12 in the steroid group, and you can see that in figure 2. And I'm tipping that some people got a recurrence and got worse at that point. That's not really, possibly this is where the attrition comes into it as well, because there was quite a few people that had attrition. So I wonder whether that recurrence might have been even more of a factor if there wasn't a 20 or so % attrition at that 12-month point. So that's something to consider. It's certainly seems like some people, there would have been a handful of people, but overall as a group they're still continuing overall to improve, and by 2 years they were still better than the placebo group, which is a really important finding as well. So even though there's some recurrence for some people, there possibly is a benefit at 2 years. So this is really really strong data, I think, and we shouldn't ignore it. We should, yes, there are limitations, but it's an important contribution, and I think what we need to do now is try and replicate it and understand it more. So that's possibly where we need to go. I think another possible limitation is it might have been underpowered, particularly at those later time points because of the attrition, because there was a fair bit of attrition at that time point. One of the really interesting things that they hint at is what are the therapeutic effects, and I'm 100% sure. It sort of suggests that it's mainly a steroid effect, and the exercise maybe is not having a tendon-specific effect, because exercise you'd expect to proliferate cells and lead to mechanotransduction adaptation. Maybe the exercise is having other effects, psychological or muscle effects, and not effects on the tendon level, and the steroid is just allowing that tissue to really calm down. So look, I think it's a really interesting and important contribution. So I'm going to, very interested to see what other people have to say about it. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening, and I'll post the paper with the show as well. Thanks. See you next time.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.